So in 2024, I decided to get back into reading. And I did set up a very, very small goal for myself, but I didn't realize how much I've read until I piled up all the books that I read together. It was a giant pile, and it made me really happy because, good job. Anyways, so my 2024 book recap. I read a very diverse set of books. I read fantasy, I read romantasy, I read literature, classic literature, and basically I read everything that I could get my hands on. So let's dive in. Starting off with A Gentleman in Moscow. I absolutely loved this book. I would say if I should start a series of books that reminded me of Ghibli movies, and this would be like on top of it. It's really funny because it's set in the backdrop of something very dark, like a Russian, right, like the Russian Revolution, and it talks about how it impacted somebody who wasn't very very important, how it impacted their lives, how it impacted their culture, what were the differences that came about, how the change was good or bad or whatever, and how this one man goes through that change and how it impacts its life. And it's just very, very wonderful to read about. The next book, not in any exact order, I'm just picking them up as I go. The Meek One by Dostoevsky. So I got into Dostoevsky because my sister was really into it and she always recommended me reading it, and I was just like, I'll get to it, but I never did. So I started with like something smaller, something not so heavy, The Meek One. And I have to say, he controls the way you think through his words. Because at the start of the book, I'm just hating this character and I don't like him, and I'm like, saying things about it, and I've even annotated it as well. But by the end of it, I'm like, oh wow, what just happened? And yes. Then I read The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, and this book left me feeling very, very unsettled. Like something was missing in my life, but I couldn't really point out what. But yes. And that is the theme of the book. It revolves around, this island where people just stop having association with things and they just vanish out of their memory. And if you do not have an association with anything, why would you want to have it in your life? And they don't have any control over it. And it's just very hauntingly beautiful to read. I recently finished Days at the Murasaki Bookshop. And again, I should start a series of books that made me feel like Ghibli movies, and this would be in it because this was like Howl's Moving Castle meets Kiki's Delivery Service meets The Wind Rises. It was beautiful. It was light-hearted, and when you're like imagining when you're reading and you're imagining the scenery around it, and you have like a picture in your mind. I could just picture it like a Ghibli movie, like the same aesthetic, the same music in the background, the same art style, and I loved it. It was like a very good read, very light-hearted. I am at a loss of words when I talk about the Poppy War. This book, the world building was so great because Arif Kong is like a genius, and I can't believe at such a young age she is able to control words so well that I could feel like physically being pulled out of the book of that world when I used to close the chapter down, and I was just like amazed by how well she tackled such dark subjects that I felt like I was there. I It was haunting. It was I need I needed therapy after finishing this book because it was just that good. And I have to read the next two parts, and I'm being lazy, but in 25 I'm going to finish this trilogy. And again, Dostoevsky. I started Dostoevsky with White Nights. This was my first book by Dostoevsky that I read, and it was just so beautiful. It was light. It was about unrequited love and one-sided love and loss and letting go, and overall it just ended on such a mellow tone that, I don't know. Like I said, he controls what you think with his words. Even though this was written in the 19th century, he still controls how you think when you're reading the book. I love Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson, if you ever see this, please know that you're the reason I got back into reading. You. So I think I would need to do like a separate video just for the Stormlight archives, especially Oathbringer, because this book was a journey for me. I was crying in the last 100 pages, and amazing. I cannot do justice by talking about it in one video. So I will go to a book that I had very high hopes from, but turned out to be so bad. Mm. And that is The Unfamiliar. The Familiar, sorry. And when I think about it, the only thing that comes to my mind is, imagine you are writing a story where the characters are like Batman and Alfred. But by the end of it, Batman and Alfred are like into each other. The book felt like it was, the first half of it was written by somebody else and the second half of it was written by somebody else. And I'm a sucker for historic fiction. And I really enjoyed that it was set in the backdrop of the Anglo-Spanish Wars, but I don't know, girl. I don't know what this was. I'm disappointed. If we were villains. So I'm a sucker for dark academia. I think I'm going to say I'm a sucker a lot. We can start a counter for that. So I love dark academia. I think you can tell. If We Were Villains was like a little slow to get into, but I really enjoyed reading it. I'm not big on Shakespeare. I did not read a lot of Shakespeare in O levels, but it was very interesting to read. I was guessing who could it be, who did that, he's acting like this, maybe it's him, and it was like I felt engrossed. It's not one of my most favorite books of the years, but it was definitely up there, and I really enjoyed reading it. Again, if I say I'm going to talk about Brandon Sanderson, I need to make another video because I love Brandon Sanderson. He's the reason why I got back into reading, and I can't do justice. So I started Mistborn Saga. I read The Final Empire. You can tell by the bookmarks how much I enjoyed reading it, and I love it. So I will talk about it in detail in another video. Speaking of fantasy and dark academia, one of the best books that I read this year. This talks about colonization in a way that you feel heard and seen. And I didn't even realize that, living in a country, being part of a country that was colonized, I haven't seen that narrative being talked about from my perspective. So when I was reading this, there's a character in it, Rami, and he's a Muslim, he's from the subcontinent. The struggles he faces, I could relate to it. And by the end of the book, in the middle of it, I cried because it was just so relatable, and it makes you think that, how does it feel to be heard? So when you talk about, inclusivity and representation, I never really realized until I saw that representation that how amazing it could be. And talking about it, I'm like a little teary-eyed because the book was so well written from that perspective. And I think everybody, I would want to see somebody from the white world. The white world is not the right term, and I'm really sorry for that. But everybody should read it to, horizon your perspective on what the other perspective might be. So yes. And I'm not above everybody else, so I did read Fourth Wing. In fact, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame were like the third or fourth books that I read in the start of the year. And I'm a sucker for dragons. Sucker. I love dragons. I love reading about dragons. I read Aragon because dragons. I read Lord of the Rings because dragons. I read Game of Thrones because, you guessed it right, dragons. So of course I was going to read Fourth Wing. And I know people hate it, and that's fine. The writing is very surface level. The world building is very weak. But the plot, I'm just reading it for the plot. And like you can tell, I also marked bookmarks. It's bookmarked. And I enjoyed reading it. I mean, you can hate me, you can not like me, whatever, but I'm not above everybody else. Enjoyed reading Fourth Wing. I'm looking forward to reading the next book. Now, these are all the physical copies that I had. I also made the wise decision of buying myself a Kindle because my very wise friend Iman told me that, if we buy a Kindle, we might not be spending so much money on buying books. And that's like a smart thing to do. But I did buy books. I did buy a lot of books. And I also bought a Kindle. And I think one of my goals for starting this channel was, I want Amazon to sponsor me and get a free Kindle out of them. So yes, I have some books on my Kindle as well that I read this year. Starting off with Good Material by Dolly Alderton. It was very light. It was a very light read. I would call it one of my side quests. I finished it in a day. It talks about, moving on from relationships and how you lose your personality when you're with somebody. And often that is the reason why relationships fail. So I really, really enjoyed reading it. Another book that I read was I Who Have Never Known Men. Now I'm going to make enemies when I say this, but I absolutely hated this book. This book was a walking simulator in a book, and I will do a detailed review on that as well. Apart from that, I read Pachinko. I loved Pachinko. Pachinko, although was set in an era where in South Korea and Japan and North Korea for that matter, but it transcended borders because the things that were being talked about in the book in that region were some things that resonated with me in the subcontinent as well. I could still hear my mom say those things to me, and I just felt so connected to the characters. I cried a lot of times reading this book. I wish I could read it all over again and forget about it and then read it all over again, but yes. I also read One Dark Window, and I mean, it was good. It wasn't great. I mean, the story was weak. It was about magic, but nothing was explained. I mean, pick a struggle. You can talk about smart and stuff and be all fourth wingy, or you can talk about the magic system and the world building and be all Brandon Sanderson. But you cannot not have anything. And it just felt it was yeah, I have a book. And I also went through the trouble of reading A Court of Thorns and Roses. I don't like it. That is why I did not read the next part. I have it on my Kindle, but I couldn't get myself to read the next part because I did not know what the hype was about. It was just so... And again, I have to keep reminding myself that I cannot judge fantasy and all the fantasy books on Brandon Sanderson 11 because Brandon Sanderson is over here and Out of Corn reaches the level. But then yes, and I feel like I am missing some books, so I guess there might be a part 2. But yes, so those were all the books that I read in 2024, and there are a lot of series that I started, a lot of trilogies that I started that I will be completing, that I aim to complete next year. If you have any book suggestions for me, do send them my way. If you want me to, review a specific book, I'm really open to that as well. And if you stayed this long for this video, thank you so much for listening to me yap. Please subscribe.